This meeting is being recorded.
All right, so over to me for the first couple of minutes. So welcome everybody to this plenary session hosted by the Sensitive Data Interest Group. Today's session is on a shared understanding of sensitive data, and we're really doing an update on the work that's been done thus far by the interest group, engaging you in some activities and discussion around that and future directions. And we also have our guest presenter, Sushil, who I'll be introducing in a moment. So I sometimes forget that these are international things, and it's worth pointing out that I'm joining from Canberra, which is the capital city of Australia, and it's the traditional home of the Ngunnawal people. So before we get started with today's session, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands I'm joining you from. I pay my respect to their elders past and present. And I invite all of you who join us from colonialised lands to use the chat channel to acknowledge the First Nations people and traditional custodians of your region. So our agenda for today, I've simplified it here for those of you joining in at home. A quick introduction from me, and then I'll be handing over to Sushil, who's our invited presenter, who'll be speaking for a little while, and then we'll do a bit of guided discussion and any kind of Q&A that people would like to engage in. And then the other co-chairs of this working group will be taking you through the second half of the session and some activities and updates. So as means of a quick intro, I should probably introduce myself. My name is Kristen Kang. I'm one of the co-chairs of this group, and I work at the Australian Research Data Commons. There are many co-chairs of this group currently, but I'd like to acknowledge in particular a few people who've really contributed to the formation of this session and some of the work you're going to see in it. Apologies for leaving people out, but I think we all know that there's a few people here who really keep this all moving along. So that's Alex, Roman, Nicola, and especially Crystal, who I think if this was a publication, Crystal would be the first author. She really keeps things moving. So before we get on to the initial presentation, I'm wanting to get a sense of who's in the room at the moment. I think it looks like we've got 30 people in here. So I don't think it's going to work in 3 minutes to really get everyone to introduce themselves, or does anyone want to overrule me on that one and say that we do a quick round of introductions? Yes, no, need some kind of response from you all. Alex, Nicola, I can see you guys.
In the chat.
Intros in the chat. Okay, that would be great. So if we use the chat channel, and keeping in mind it's very hard for me to see the chat channel. Okay, yep, okay, now I can see the chat channel. If everyone would like to just pop in what country or region that they're joining us from, and maybe what kind of research domain or discipline you're working from. So I'm joining, as I said, from Australia. I work predominantly in the health and medical research domain, and for a data infrastructure organization. So just a line or two about yourself so we can see who's in the room. And as like many of you, I have been doing this whole Zoom thing for a couple of years now intensively, and I'm really comfortable with uncomfortable silences. So I'm going to pause and wait for everyone to pop into chat who you are and where you're joining us from. So thank you, Stephanie and Sushil, for kicking us off. Where are my other co-chairs?
We have the excitement of 2 chats. because Zoom is nested inside the Hoover platform. So some people are using the Hoover chat and some people are using the Zoom chat. I think, Kristen, you can only see the Zoom chat. So I can tell you that there is other information.
Okay. All right. Well, since I can't see the Hoover chat without probably breaking my computer and my own brain, I'm going to assume that everyone is playing nice, and I thank you all so much for doing that. In the Zoom chat, which is apparently only half of it, I can see a few of my colleagues based here in Australia at the ARDC. I can see someone from Hawaii. Wouldn't those of us who don't live in the tropics love to do a trip to somewhere like Hawaii after the last couple of years? France, Finland, Japan. Excellent. All right. So I didn't get you all verbally chatting, but at least hopefully that works as some form of an icebreaker. And I think a couple minutes of me talking at you is more than anyone really needs. So, oh yes, Crystal, excellent point. Anyone who is joining us from the middle of the night in your region, my special apologies for having to deal with me at the start of this, but I'm going to hand you over now to someone who should be much more interesting and enjoyable to listen to. So our invited presentation today is from Sushil. Sushil is a technologist with close to 2 decades experience in leadership and delivering strategic and technology solutions for complex transnational health research. In previous roles at EMBL, EBI and Elixir, he led international portfolios of data science projects in multiple jurisdictions and research infrastructures. So acronyms some of you might recognize like EMBL, Elixir, EOSC and GA4GH. He's currently the Chief Technology Officer and Director of Engineering at Health Data Research UK, HDR UK. He provides leadership and in-depth expertise in innovative technical solutions using distributed data, network and software technologies across scientific and clinical domains, and is a thought leader in the development of trusted research environments. Today Sushil will be sharing his experiences working with health data and how this is understood by different stakeholders. So I'd like to now hand you over to Sushil. Sushil, please start sharing your screen whenever you're ready, and thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. So apologies in advance. So I'm also up in the middle of the night. It's about 4 o'clock here in the United Kingdom. Let me hopefully open that up. Right. So good morning, everyone. My name is Sushil. Again, just as an extra bit of info, as CTO of Health Data Research UK, I mainly attend meetings and send emails. I don't do a lot of the work. A lot of the work that I'm presenting today is a whole community of work that's been happening in the UK. And again, even with my past jobs as well in Elixir, EMBL and GA4GH, it has been a community-wide effort to try and pull together different threads of activities to access data, to analyze data, and then publish the results of our work. So apologies for the pun in the title of my talk. It all will be revealed in a few minutes. But the title of the talk is Seeing the Forest to the Trees. There's a meaning for forest and there's a meaning for TREs. But before we get into forests and TREs, I just want to give you an idea of our definition of sensitive data. And again, this is a community-wide effort to pull together different threads of definitions. But again, one of the documents from Finland, in fact, the CSE Finland, has been quite useful, and we've distilled some of our thoughts from the ICO and other regulatory agencies here as well. But I just want to start with one phrase which is incredibly vital for us in health data research. Information is power, and human information is power over human beings. And that is fundamentally the basis. Understanding that understanding who has control over access to that information gives us an idea about what to protect and what to preserve in terms of information privacy and data protection. In terms of sensitive data, I'm not going to read through all of this. Fundamentally, we define it as something that needs to be protected against unwarranted disclosure. And this is this may be due to many different reasons: legal, ethical, privacy is usually for personal data, but they may also be for proprietary reason or for endangered species reasons as well. So anything that deals with something that needs to be protected is our definition of sensitive data. And the reason why we define it as sensitive data, not just personal or health data, even though we're dealing with health data, we have a very holistic view of health. Health is not just about data from the NHS, for example. Environmental data, ecological data are all parts of the pieces of the puzzle that determines that health outcome. So personal data comes through our definition through the GDPR and UK's implementation of the Data Protection Act, which is the UK's version of GDPR, and some special categories there that goes into detail about sensitive data. I won't go into the details of that, but beyond that, there's also commercial and governmental data, which is also sensitive, commercially sensitive, like trade secrets, business data, and so on. And then you have environmental data about endangered and commercially sensitive species, which usually, in terms of health research, model organisms, for example, are parts and pieces of data that is used for pharmacological research, but also for health research as well. And once you determine what sensitive data is, you have to have, through legal routes, a fair and lawful and transparent use of that data for a specific purpose. It needs to be adequate and minimized, has to be accurate. So there's a long list of things that needs to be done, regardless of the kind of, or the type of data, type of sensitive data that you're using. And the key phrase through all of that is to make sure data protection and privacy is adhered throughout the entire process. So I just want to give you that high level view of our interpretation of that. Of course, there's a worldwide community understanding because each jurisdiction will have different nuances, and that's why some of these groups like yourselves are important, and we're being part of it, trying to improve our understanding of sensitive data. But what is the problem that we're trying to solve in HDA UK through our definition of sensitive data? This is one example of the entire end-to-end chain of a research project trying to access health data. So this is accessing three different data sets from 4 different data custodians. And you can see it started off in 2018 by kicking off some internal university ethics review process. Then we went through HRA, we went through CAG, which are all regulatory and legal agencies here in the UK. And then you contact the different data custodians, and you can see where the initial submission was made, where further information is requested, the chases for information, getting approvals from various different people, getting cohort sent for linkage because you're trying to link multiple data sets together, and then finally getting access to the data. And you can see COVID-19 as a small blocker here, but it's not the only blocker. This entire data access request process took 2.5 years. And bear in mind, this is a 4-year project. That literally means there are postdocs, PhD students, master students, literally twiddling their thumbs. Now, in reality, we know that's not true, but still, there are people who've gotten the grant that they were funded to do their research. They cannot access the data because of the legal, ethical, technical, and regulatory hurdles that they need to access sensitive data. And this is why sensitive data and definition, what we need to do, is incredibly important. One way of trying to streamline access to such types of data is through the use of trusted research environments. So, but this is just to paint you a picture of what is the main problem, the governance hurdles to access data. So I mentioned trusted research environments. Trusted research environments, you've heard these, you must have heard the concept before, because literally it's a secure data center to access data, but with extra security controls and governance controls embedded within them. They've been known as data safe haven, secure data environments. But somewhere where sensitive data is held, and there's a governance process that wraps that data to allow people to access data. Why do we call them trust research environments? Because we have a very principled approach of how access to such data is controlled. Typically, you have information security practices, data security practices, privacy practices that is done in an ad hoc manner. What we try and do is to use the ONS 5 safe principles to make sure all of the controls are there to make data available for safe research, making sure that the data can be accessed securely and privacy is protected, making the research itself more efficient and collaborative, and be able to access data in a single location where the governance wrapper is streamlined to the maximum extent possible. And what are our 5 safe principles? The 5 safe principles basically are asking 5 questions of whoever's accessing the data. 1, who are you? So safe people. So only trained and specifically accredited researchers who have undertaken information governance training and handling sensitive data can access the data. So making sure you as an individual accessing the data is safe. And that, bear in mind, implies both for the researcher, but also for the TRE operator or the data custodians themselves. The next question you're asking, what project are you trying to do? So is the data being used for ethical and approved research with the potential for a clear public benefit? So the public benefit test has to be passed there. So somebody has to go through and review the project application to make sure it's ethical and safe. The next next safe is around safe setting. So once you've gotten your approval, are you accessing the data in a safe and secure environment? You're not accessing it from a hotel room Wi-Fi on your iPad, for example. You are accessing it in a secure environment. You're going to the data with cloud controls and access controls to access the data. The next layer is, what data are you physically accessing? So do you need physical access to the data? How much data do you need? If you're doing asthma and dementia research, do you need to know somebody has comorbidities of orthopedic issues or other diagnosis conditions? So I'm trying to minimize the amount of information you absolutely need for your research, and also having the terminologies and the data harmonization all completed for you so that you're not making any misinterpretations of the data. And then finally, which is very typical, that typically not asked in many research projects, but we do get people to write impact statements. But actually, one of the things around health data is to make sure that the outputs you generate are also safe. So it's the outputs you generate from your analysis is not re-identifiable in of itself. Now, this is particularly challenging for things like AI models, for example. So if you've trained an AI model, how do you determine if the model you've generated is safe? Has it learned something about the data that you can use to re-identify patients from that model itself, forget the data itself? So these are all different questions and different controls that need to be put in place. Now, I don't intend you to understand all of this entire slide. I don't myself, but this is just to give you, there's a deeper layer of things that you need to put into place. So things like bringing together data from various different sources, linking them together, improving the metadata quality and data quality of the data, curating that into curated research-ready data sets, having a federated data linkage layer that allows you to link all of the different data sets together, because having data sets in isolation does not really help if you want to do analysis at scale. Then bringing that into a secure team workspace type of environment where you can do collaborative analysis of the data, and then have governance layers sitting on top of that to allow access to this data using a purpose-based access control, have authentication and authorization mechanisms, have metadata catalogs for you to discover what data sets are actually there in the TRE. But then also have public oversight, custodian-led governance, have data access committees, risk stratification for different types of access, and monitoring and audit controls the entire data lifecycle within a TRE. So it just gives you that overarching picture. And we don't have, and I'll openly admit, we don't have answers to all of these problems. There are some of these we do have answers to, but the combination is really hard to work through, and especially when you're dealing with multiple stakeholders, both in the NHS and also outside the NHS as well. But to very simplify a typical research workflow, and this is one of the examples that I use very often for COVID-19 research, national studies, people wanted to find data, so they wanted to search metadata. Then they needed to access those systems to understand what's there within the system. So you need to log in to a different to a set of TREs. You need to be able to define your cohort. What is the cohort you want to do your analysis? One example is the COVID-19 impact on BAME communities. So identifying ethnicity and demographic information and also COVID-19 impact and vaccination status. And then requesting access to the data, then transferring your code or analysis code into the environment for analysis, then executing your analysis, and then finally aggregating the data back out from the TREs once the analysis is complete. So if you squint hard enough, you can see the different layers of the 5 safes. So the blue layers are the discovery or safe data spaces. The red is about safe people. The green is about safe settings, and the purple is safe outputs. And again, if just to give you an idea, if this is just for one TRE is what I tried to explain before, but from a UK perspective, there are many TREs already. We have national TREs, so some of them I've already highlighted here. We have domain and location specific TREs. So this is looking at a single domain. So genomics, for example, is an example. Emble API is another one as well. We have commercial TREs, so people who provide commercial services for trusted research environments. And then you have international TREs. So I'm talking to an international audience, and I don't want to discount the fabulous work that's happening everywhere in the world. We need to learn from each other and understand what works for various different domains from a technology enablement of good data governance point of view. So I would contend that the future of TRE is already here, just unevenly distributed. And in fact, the worst part that we have is fragmented. And that's purely because of the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated a lot of our plans. Everybody set up TREs or TRE-like systems across the world, but they don't really interoperate with each other. So if you wanted to do a large-scale analysis, it's impossible to do so today because they don't interoperate with each other, which also detracts from managing data protection and data privacy at scale, because you're now dealing with another layer of governance, technology governance across the board. So in terms of federation, the approach we take is very similar to past experiences, but again, going through those 5 safes all over again, but trying to deal with it from a principle and technology and standards point of view. So for the first layer is identity federation. How do you move people's identity, as in researchers' identity, across different systems so you know who you are as you access the system? Now, you might be familiar with single sign-on, but essentially it's a glorified version of single sign-on, but allows you to transfer over data access rights as you go through the system. So if you've already been granted access in one TRE, you can access the same data in another TRE as well without getting another login account. Moving analytics around. So once you've written your analysis code in the open using workflow technologies or even notebooks or any Docker containers, you're able to move that analytics to various different TREs. Then data federation, metadata federation, being able to discover data from multiple different sources, link them together, and also make data get aggregates outputs out from the various different environments. And finally, infrastructure federation. It's inconceivable that a single TRE will be able to provide every single compute and storage infrastructure that you would need. For example, if you wanted to do a particular bioinformatics pipeline with a bioinformatics core processor, which is a specific set of hardware, you wouldn't want to build it into your own TRE, join up with another TRE federation that has that capability, burst out into their cloud platform and run that analysis and come back down. So you need to build secure pipes between the different infrastructures. And this is, again, just going through a layered approach of trying to build this from scratch. Once the the genie's out of the bottle because there's already a lot of TREs. And again, we don't see TREs, the Federation of CAs, as one different level. So there is no one model of TREs. And this is the forest that I was trying to mention. The forest is mainly around the federated, open, and resilient ecosystem of secure TREs. And for that, you need to be able to bring the entire TRE ecosystem for the journey. It does not mean you have to be fully federated. You can still exist in this ecosystem with a localized TRE for your local research population. But when you do want to move up the level to provide wider access, bigger access to larger data sets, more analytical power, we provide guidance and support and standards and software to allow you to move across those levels. And you don't have to go fully into one single level. You can move into a completely federated, fully federated, safe settings where you have cloud access from multiple different sources, but you can still be completely local, and you can mix and match to be part of it. But the point is, when you move between these levels, there is standards and interoperability built in from the outset to allow you to do so. And that requires a lot of thought and a lot of effort to make sure all of these different levels can interoperate with each other. But the last part, and this is my last concept that I wanted to introduce in my talk, I've talked about the technology, I've talked about the data, I've talked about access. One of the bigger problems we have right now is understanding the data governance structures. And this is particularly important when you're dealing with sensitive data. The type of research you do determines the type of data governance structure that needs to be put into place to support your research. And this is just a very simple way of trying to look at the types of data governance that's required. So closed and restricted, so you're doing a one-to-one type of relationship between a data custodian and a researcher, all the way up to citizen science. We need to be able to support those forms of research analytics as well, and everything in between. And you can see trusted research is just one layer, one example of a data governance structure that allows you to solve some to many type activity. The more open you can be in terms of your data, in terms of your data sharing contracts, you're able to do more types of analysis. And sometimes one-to-one sharing is even better because you get a constrained view to be able to move fast. So there is no one-stop shop in terms of data governance, and there are many different forms of this as well. So how do we think about operationalizing data governance at scale? So we first start with the principles, and there's the pair principles, the care principles. Do we need a safe principle? Do we already have trust, for example, as one of the principles? Then we set out to define what our requirements, roles, and responsibilities and rules of participation is within that ecosystem. Then we define the interoperable standards, processes, policies, and frameworks. By the way, a lot of this has been written into our green and white papers already, but we're working with NHS Transformation Directorate and other organizations in the UK to make this happen. We're also putting together modular design patterns, software, and libraries that you can buy off the shelf or even use open source to implement on your own. Then have exemplars, extensible use cases, training, awareness, and community engagement to try and build all of this together. The eagle-eyed amongst you might have already noticed it comes together as an acronym for the PRIME directive. So again, to build together a United Federation of Planets or United Federation of TREs, you kind of need to pull together all these different layers. And it's not enough just to solve this through technology. That's the point. It has to be done at a complete level because it has to deal with multiple stakeholders, with multiple politics involved as well. So to build together all of this, you need to use data as infrastructure. You need to have clinical and scientific driver programs at the center. In our example, it has to be UK-wide, but again, have an international collaborative network of science, deal with diverse types of data, build thought leadership, expertise for approaches to trust and governance and standards, be an exemplar for team science, have patient involvement and engagement. And I want to emphasize this. We've been incredibly successful to engage patients throughout the entire process. In fact, a lot of patients are already co-investigators in our research as well. That actually helped shape the research process and been incredibly beneficial to us as well. And then build on the training aspect of that as well. I'll skip through some of these slides, but again, through our public dialogue, we've had, we've got topics around trustworthiness, access and accreditation, balancing risks and benefits, and public involvement and engagement. But very quickly, a lot of the public has always said we want the use of your data to be public, open and transparent. Has to be meaningful engagement with the patients. Efforts should be made to raise awareness of security processes, and supporting data across the UK system must be unified as much as possible. And that therein lies a rub. Unification requires a lot of stakeholders talking to each other, like the conversations we're having today. And sensitive data should be made available for research when it is in the public benefit. Determination of public benefit is the hard part. There as well. Again, there's a lot that we've done over the last 2 years. In fact, 3 of us met for lunch to try and define what we need to do around trust research, around environments in the world and trust. And a lot of the work has followed since then. And right now, we're just at the cusp of a lot of money being released through the NHS and through UKRI and other funding agencies to join up the dots between NHS, UKRI and other funding sources as well. So thank you for listening. If you want to learn more about the work that we've done in TREs and how we're dealing with sensitive data, please go here. These are just some holiday snaps about forests. Again, forgive the pun again. But lastly, do we want a forestry commission who's responsible for increasing the value of TREs, expanding and promoting and protecting the sustainable management of TREs across all 4 nations. I think I've punned you out by the end of this talk. Thank you.
I, for one, loved the puns, especially the, and I'm playing my hand here, the Star Trek reference. Love it. But thank you so much, Sushila. That was fantastic overview of all the work that you're doing and some really important concepts that, from my view of the world, HDR UK is definitely breaking a lot of ground in this area. So there've been a couple of questions that have come in, and we are already running a little bit over time because we do have a update from the co-chairs on the interest group activities and a group activity for everyone. So it's not just sitting and watching this time, we need you all to interact. But before we move on to that, I can see just a couple of questions that have come in through chat that Sushil, if you don't mind, if you just have a quickish response to, that would be great. So one has come in from Paulette, who said, how do you align forest with FIGA? I'm not sure if people say it that way, but it's Federated EGA. I personally am not familiar with that, but Paulette says, it seems to me that they have the same philosophy or purpose.
Yeah, it's very much aligned. Apologies for overrunning. I didn't see the chat as well. Very quickly though, it is very much aligned. So Federated EGA is a federated mechanism of distributed data storage and access within bioinformatics and genomics in general. It's currently being co-run through MBLEVI in the UK and in Spain, but that only solves the data layer. It only solves the data access layer. It doesn't solve the analytical layer. It doesn't solve the research identity layer. It doesn't solve the infrastructure layer. So we need that. It's one of the layers that we need to build as part of a federated ecosystem, but we need to build a holistic view because trust and governance needs to be embedded in all of those layers, not just on the data, but that's an incredibly vital component for genomics data management. What the key there is understanding what the standards and software is in the data layer and its interfaces to all of the layers above. So think of the internet. The internet runs on multiple different protocols. Think of building every single protocol along that stack, all the way from your physical interfaces to TCP/IP, UDP, HTTP, and build security throughout that entire stack.
Brilliant. And Paulette also says, thank you in the chat for making it clear. There's a question here from Pascal. Is your TRE, or can your TRE be reused in other countries? What if research is an international collaboration?
And that's a really good question. So because data don't leave from a TRE, so data, once it's collected within a data custodian and stored within a trust research firm, you have international access. So rather than a data sharing agreement, you have a data access agreement. So international collaborators are more than welcome to come in to access data within that TRE. So international collaboration is possible to allow data to be combined from multiple sources. So for example, for the rare disease in an international collaboration setting, you have to access data in physically in multiple different locations, run federated analytics. So if you're able to decouple your analysis into small pieces where you run one analysis in Germany, another one in France, and another one in the UK, you should be able to do so. Where you can't do that, and there are specific examples where you can't really split the analysis, you need to bring it all together. The idea would be to have a trusted third party where you move some parts of the data into a trusted third party, run the analysis there, and at the end of that analysis, the trusted third party deletes all of that data away. International collaboration is already happening. So through our ICODAS, the International COVID Data Alliance that we run, we have a lot of international collaboration that happens within the UK as well. And we do send a lot of the data, all of our genomic data goes into GISAID and is available in the Elixir and EOS platforms as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Sushil. I do need to move us on now and hand over to Alex. I did note, and this is going to be a really forced segue at the start of your talk, that you're talking about some definitions of the concept of sensitive data under GDPR and others. And that's actually the focus of a lot of the work that the group has been doing. I also had some questions, if we had more time, around the difference between virtual research environments, secure research environments, and trusted research environments, already knowing the answer to that. But we don't have time for that discussion, but more to introduce the concept of what are all these terms that we're using and how can we come to a common understanding of them. And with that, I'll hand over to Alex.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Sushil, for speaking to us today, and hello, everybody. So now we're moving to our sort of group activities and discussion and review of the vocabularies work that we've been doing, that our Sensitive Data Interest Group has been working on with our membership in regular community meetings and at plenaries such as today. So in our October 2021 community meeting, we initiated a conversation on preparing a list of terms used to discuss sensitive data. And the purpose of this was further to develop our shared understanding of the terminology we use, also the relative importance of each term and the ways in which these interact with one another across different contexts and regions. So we prepared a survey that was co-designed with the privacy implications of research datasets interest group. And our aim here was to collect information about how sensitive data and privacy issues were defined and understood. So we deployed the survey to our combined membership, around 200 people internationally, as well as affiliated groups. And when we last spoke about this, we had collected approximately 55 or so responses, but I checked recently, we're almost up to 100, but we will need to comb through these more carefully. So we presented some initial or preliminary results at our April community meeting, and this indicated that, for example, most participants were in Europe, the United States and Australia. We identified also some recurring research areas and disciplines of our survey participants. And regarding participant levels of experience, most identified as moderately experienced to experienced, but far fewer participants identified themselves as only a little experienced or, on the other end, very experienced. And finally, our participants shared with us various terms that they identified as important together with their relative frequency. So although this got us off to a strong start, our key learning from this activity was that we needed to conduct further and more in-depth work about what we ourselves mean when referring to sensitive data. And we also need to investigate further the types of terminology we use to define and describe our work. And specifically, perhaps in relation to existing glossaries. Therefore, further work is required, and we hope to initiate this with you today. So Crystal and Nicola, you are going to guide us through this, and Crystal, I hand over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Alex. I'm just going to share my screen. So to confirm, you can see some slides. Whoops. And now you can see them in presentation mode. I can't see anyone's faces.
Confirmed.
Thank you, Nicola. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly give a bit of context to what led us to undertaking this vocabularies work. I see some members of our community are here on the call, so for you this will all be reliving the past, so feel free to go and make a cup of tea if you like. But for those of you who haven't been attending our community meetings, this context might be helpful. And Nicola will be on track to start the Miro board activity at 20 past, so we've got heaps of time for that still. Okay, so yes, as Alex mentioned, we've refocused our vocabulary work over the last few months. I'm just going to skip back a slide, Google willing. Yes, there we go. So we've refocused our vocabulary work over the last few months. And so this has involved us collecting existing glossaries and vocabularies on sensitive data and crosswalking the definitions that we've found within these. So the goal of this work is to create a set of definitions for sensitive data for this interest group, as well as to identify regional and disciplinary differences in these definitions. So this is what's going to be the focus of the remainder of this session, and that's going to be led by Nicola very shortly. But before we do this, by way of context setting, I just want to take you briefly through the last few months that have gotten to this point. And what you see on your screen here is the roadmap for the interest group for 2022. And this work was part of the roadmap. We just fast-tracked it a little bit. If you want to read more about our interest group roadmap, feel free to jump onto Zenodo and take a look. Okay, so why did we take this path? So as Alex mentioned, at our March community meeting, we reviewed the survey progress to date, and we identified that we needed more responses from the survey to get a meaningful result out of this exercise. So as a community, we discussed what the goals of the survey were. So we asked ourselves as a community, is the goal to develop a comprehensive description and analysis of how sensitive data differs across regions and disciplines? Or is the goal to develop a working vocabulary for the group with some background understanding on how the vocabularies might differ in usage within our own community? And so we agreed that the goal was actually the second option, so to develop a working vocabulary. Next, we discussed how we'd get there. So the survey was certainly and is certainly one way we can progress this goal, but we also wanted to progress it in other ways as well, given our response rate challenges with the survey. And so to this end, we decided to examine existing vocabularies and glossaries. Yep, perfect. I'm just going to jump ahead there. Okay, so at our April community meeting then, we undertook a community activity to begin this vocabulary crosswalking exercise. So the first step was to, well, gather existing vocabularies and glossaries on sensitive data. So at the community meeting, we undertook a group search activity where we asked our community to list any resources that they knew of, which included sensitive data definitions. And while people could add any resource they liked, the flavour of the resources we were looking for were those that had quite literally a list of terms and definitions, such as the sensitive data for research, which was shown in the I'm getting a little bit of, oh yeah, perfect. Thank you, Nicola. So this was a very pragmatic decision, looking for these really explicit vocabularies and glossaries. This was a very pragmatic decision because the work we're undertaking in this vocabularies crosswalking exercise, it's just the first of many steps in developing a shared understanding. So the goal of this initial activity is to get a foothold into the area. So therefore, we wanted to start with the most easily identifiable definitions of sensitive data. And then using the spreadsheet that you can see on the top left of your screen, the group quite literally just dumped resources into the columns. And we did call for additional input after that community meeting, and that post is shown in the right-hand side, but most of the contributions have been made during our community meetings. So after that exercise, we then as co-chairs began examining the resources shared, and we did some initial tidying. So we just pulled out a bit more information from the vocabularies and glossaries shared, and we used that initial tidying to develop a spreadsheet where we could list all of the terms from the resources that were shared in our community meetings. So out of the 17 unique resources that were initially shared, we found 4 of those resources gave an explicit list of term definition. And it's these 4 resources, which you can see along the columns of your screen here now. So they were the GDPR definitions, already foreshadowed. Thank you, Shaseel. The Australian resource, an Australian resource titled Sensitive Data Information, a specific subset of personal information under the Privacy Act 1988, the Cassray Research Data Management Glossary, and the Sensitive Data Toolkit for Researchers, Part 1. So column A in this spreadsheet listed all the terms that we found across these 4 resources, and there were 588 unique terms in total in the spreadsheet. The definitions for each resource is given in the corresponding cell, and so some resources define the same term, but most resources were actually using different terms. So in undertaking the initial work for this, the initial preparation for this work, we did notice a few things that needed further clarification, and this is what Nicola is going to focus on with you now in more detail. But basically, we needed to continue to look across these terms to identify which of the terms were specifically about sensitive data, which of the terms which might not be specifically about sensitive data, but which would still be useful in a sensitive data vocabulary. And then finally, which of the terms are using slightly different words, but essentially mean the same thing? These are the 3 big questions that we are facing now. And that brings us here to the community meeting today. So it's our aim that through undertaking further processing of these terms, so through identifying relevant terms and through grouping similar terms, we're able to create a curated list of sensitive data terms and definitions from these 4 resources. And then after we have this curated list of terms and definitions, that's when we will undertake a crosswalking of the definitions, because obviously crosswalking 558 is probably not going to be an achievable task. So without any further ado, I'm now going to throw over to Nicola right at 1:20. And you're on mute, Nicola.
Of course I am. Of course I am. Brilliant. Thanks, Crystal. So yeah, we're going to try and do some of this work together now live. This kind of activity is always fun in large groups internationally online, just to see if it actually works. But I'm posting a link now into both chats, so hopefully everyone can access it. And I'm just going to hang back here for a second to see if anyone has any trouble. Oh, brilliant. I'm already seeing people start to pop up in the Miro board as they click on that. So I'm going to share my screen for a second and show you what we're looking at. So if I fix the screen.
Nicola, I'm not sure if it's just me, but your audio is a bit crackly.
The same for me.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me see if there is anything that I can close down to try and improve that performance, but I'm pretty sure. I'm just going to, yeah, my video is off. Are we still having problems?
Okay, so you're still being fairly crackly there. Do we still have you, Nicola?
Okay. Yes, I should be here, but I'm also breaking up my audio. How frustrating.
Okay, so yeah, it's still coming through. We're only getting little bits of you.
Would it help if I shared screen, Nicola, and then
yeah,
one less?
Let's try that. Let's give that a go.
Yes,
Nicola,
I think that is sharing. A good thing for us to try.
Okay, so give me a second. I'll just grab my share screen up.
So am I coming through clearer now?
That's much better. Maybe flick off your video just for bandwidth.
Okay, so you can see the mirror board.
Perfect. Okay.
That sounds a lot better, guys.
Yes.
Yes.
Brilliant. Sorry, everyone. Clearly, my internet connection can't handle the recording and the Miro board and Zoom all at once. So everyone should be able to see our shared Miro board here, both in the share screen, but also if they follow that link. And basically, we have a fairly simple little sorting activity to do here today. So all of those 500 odd terms that we pulled out of those glossaries have been turned into sticky notes in this Miro board. And you should have the ability to drag and drop sticky notes here. So I've done a bit of this task to start us off, but you're allowed to disagree with how I've sorted things. You can see that I've pulled some things into being not specifically about sensitive data. Out of those, some I've decided, yeah, they're not specifically about sensitive data, but I think they're still essential to a sensitive data glossary. You can see them in the little sub box there, thanks, Crystal. And then there were some terms which I thought, nope, these are definitely specifically about sensitive data. So I've dragged them over into that box there. So I've done a chunk of these, but there's a good chunk still to go. And then once we've sorted these terms into their boxes, the next thing that we want to do is to pull together terms that are closely related, which will help us to find the ones which really are just different ways of saying the same thing. Yeah, so it's a fairly simple little drag and drop activity. A couple of notes on using Miro. One thing is that if you find, like I do, that the cursors make you feel slightly seasick, seeing everyone working at once, you can actually turn that off. So yeah, Crystal's showing you now, it's up in hide collaborators cursors, and it just turns off, so you can just work without seeing 1,000 cursors moving at once. And if you look at a term and you're not sure exactly what it means, we've actually included all of the definitions in an embedded spreadsheet, which is up in the top left. So if you double click on that spreadsheet, you should be able to see a Google Sheet, which will take you to all the definitions. So I always forget to include background music for this kind of activity.
We
but
look
it
forward
actually
to
gives
you
us
singing.
a nice opportunity. Oh, you should. It's stunning. But it actually gives us a nice opportunity, I think, to talk a little bit about well, anything that interests us at this time. One of the things that I noticed as I started to pull these terms together is that the terms that I thought were quite useful in the essential to a sensitive data glossary included things about roles and responsibilities. So I pulled custodian and owner in there, and I think that that's going to be one where we're going to get some very varied definitions. But something I'm also interested in is whether people sort of scour this list and start to notice that there are things that really feel like they're missing. And I think we're going to have some, there's going to have to be some next steps beyond, we have these existing vocabs, we're pulling out the terms that we think are really important. We can look at the ways that those different vocabularies define those terms. But I think that, we're pretty aware that these vocabularies come from a kind of a limited background in terms of their region. They may not represent some very discipline-specific terms. Some of these terms are going to be defined in some places by law or regulation. And so, for instance, one of the sources we have here is actually an Australian legal framework. So that's going to be quite specific to our context. So this is only a first step in terms of putting this together. And I guess I have some ideas about maybe how we go from here. Maybe we do some of that initial crosswalking. I'm just going to mute whoever's giving us some feedback, or ask everyone to mute themselves just for the moment, and then I'll be quiet and then someone else can talk. But yeah, so I think we'll do some of this initial crosswalking, but then we're going to have to do some work to check whether or not we're missing anything really important, whether there are maybe some sort of biases in the discipline or regions that are represented here, and whether we need to have any caveats to this vocabulary or additions to this vocabulary to really make it fully useful, or whether it's good enough to sort of get started with. So did anyone have any thoughts they wanted to raise on this activity as we work through it?
Maybe can we just check? I think we've got 12 or 13 people in the Miro board at the moment, and I can see that we have about 23 people in the meeting room. Is anyone having any problems joining Miro or contributing to the activity?
I just have a question about the result, because when one people put the sticker in the sensitive data toolbox, does it mean that all the peoples are agree with that or not, or it's independent?
That's a really good point. I think that there's definitely so all of the stuff that I dumped in as not specifically about sensitive data, I'm very happy to have moved out of there and for there to be some disagreement. I think also, so we assume, I think with this kind of activity, that where something ends up is kind of the, the result of multiple people looking at it and maybe moving it around. But if there's something in a place and you really don't agree with why it's there, or you have questions about why it's there, one thing you can do is add a comment to the sticky note. So I see we have one already that's on applied science. I don't know what that comment is, but you can add some, you can add comments or questions, or, you can challenge the location of something.
Yeah, okay. No, just to be sure to follow. So perhaps after this exercise, we will have some discrepancies between people's opinions, right? And
yeah, it's possible.
I would like to know how we could mitigate that.
Yeah, and I think that maybe that might have to be part of that that sort of review process that happens after this activity. So this is really a first attempt at sorting through these things.
But it's a funny tool, really.
Can I jump in with a question, Nicola?
Yeah, sure, Crystal.
So I guess just by way of capitalizing on having Sushil in the room, I wonder if any of these terms, Sushil, in your work, like jump out to you as, in your experience, they've caused real conundrums, like real misunderstandings, or been points of understanding between various stakeholders.
Yeah, so for me, I think we're looking at some of the terms where we actually fall down on, and I'll get to the positives in a few seconds, but where we fall down is mainly when we have to deal with risk. Fundamentally, accessing data is about risk management. You cannot eliminate risk completely. There's a residual risk in accessing any form of data, regardless of how anonymized you've tried to make it or how accurate you try to make it. Where we often fall down is, one, defining what the risk to access data is, and how do we classify that risk, and two, how do we mitigate that risk. And sometimes people tend to view that, oh yeah, we can just encrypt the data. That doesn't mean no risk. It just means that you've mitigated or slightly modify the risk ever so slightly, where you're managing it through a process of encrypting the data. So that is actually the hard part. And there are frameworks out there. So for example, ISO 27001 is a framework to allow you to start thinking about the data security process. It does not, just because you've done ISO certifications, does not mean your environment or your process is secure. It just means that you have understood and implemented a security management system. Where we agree on is the kind of personal identifiable information. Now, there is a caveat here, which is, at what point does personal information become sensitive information, and then so on, move into classified information, and then into secret information? There is that spectrum. So all of these things are on a spectrum. I think that's the one thing we need to remember here. So all the way from open data to sensitive data, to classified data, to top secret data, and it's that movement between the spectrum is actually hard. For us, the hardest thing is actually when a non-sensitive data becomes sensitive data. It's very easy to conceptually or intuitively understand, oh, you've taken some sensitive data, like some personal data, and you've done some analysis and you've made it into a non-sensitive data set. So for example, you've taken some health records and you've said, okay, I've correlated asthma and diabetes together, and here's a graph that shows the correlation between the two. But actually, what is really hard to understand is when you have non-sensitive data. So for example, something like Twitter, you get a Twitter file host of all the data, which is completely open public data, and you suddenly, through your analysis, transformed it into personal identifiable information. In fact, there was a research study, so going back to your comments in the chat, in the Zoom chat about privacy related pun songs, there was a great piece of work done through Spotify, for example, where through your Spotify playlist, with just 3 songs, they will be able to identify you from their data set. And that is using public information. All your playlist plays on Spotify, and everybody has access to it. And that is actually hard to get your head around. So the point is, your data gets transformed in every point in a research journey. And every time it transforms, there is a risk that needs to be managed. And that management of that risk is actually the hardest part. And what we do, sometimes it's technology, sometimes it's process, sometimes it's politics, and sometimes it's procedures that needs to be put into place. So that's why, for example, in the GDPR, we have DPIAs, which again, a lot of people agree or disagree with. But the whole point of a DPIA is to identify and look forward to all of the risk associated with the access to the data, and understand how do you go about mitigating it. It's a living document, really, that allows you to put together what do you think are the risks and how you mitigate it.
Sushil, can I ask, so I am very much not from the EU or that part of the world. Most of us have heard GDPR and know broadly what it speaks to, but the other acronym that you used was DPIA. That's not one that is in my lexicon.
Oh, yes, so apologies. Yeah, so DPIA stands for Data Protection, Data Privacy or Data Protection Impact Assessment. So essentially, it's a step before you, instead of managing the risk, you assess the risk. So you're pushing the risk management upstream, even before you access the data. Fundamentally, it's just a document that says, what's the type of data you're accessing, who's accessing it, what's the purpose, what are the fundamental risks of things going wrong. So asking you to predict what could possibly go wrong, what is the severity of that and the likelihood of each of those risks, and then you assign a score. And then based on your assessment of that, you put together a set of mitigation steps, how you mitigate it if in case things go wrong. So for example, you're accessing the data, your collaborator leaves and takes the data with them and drops the USB drive on a bus. Likelihood is low, but if that happens, how would you go about mitigating it? One way of mitigating it is by making sure the data is encrypted at all times and the keys are held elsewhere outside the system. So you just have to document that and how you manage that process. And from a regulator point of view, so from a regulatory point of view, that's all they're looking for, really. They're looking for you understand that there is some residual risk and you're able to manage that residual risk.
And I think that's a really interesting discussion, Cecilia, and much more nuanced than I'm able to contribute to. But I know definitely in Australia, I think in the world of privacy and sensitive data, the EU with GDPR stuff is probably kind of taking up the mantle across the world in trying to make progress in this space. But I'm seeing discussions over here in Australia about rethinking the existing conceptual model, which is around identification and identifiability and that kind of problematic set of terms, and looking not just at risk, but also at least in health research and use of personal health data, the balance and comparison of risk versus reward, and what you're saying in your talk about consumers actually wanting to be part of the process and wanting good stuff to be happening with their data. I didn't mean to be talking, and I can see comments in chat. And Crystal, sorry.
No, all good. Paulette, Kristen was coming through fine for me, so maybe it's your connection. I was just wondering, but there are comments in chat, probably much more interesting than my internal musings. But there are a number of terms here under the specifically about sensitive data that have comments added to them saying, well, perhaps they're not specifically about sensitive data, but maybe they're essential. And feel free to not speak if you're not comfortable, but if you are comfortable and you're perhaps somebody who moved one of these terms into this box, I'd be really curious to hear your thinking. There's no right or wrong answers, by the way. This is not a test.
There was also before, yes, I agree. And there was also some comment about there are a couple of terms that people like, this is really missing. I've actually also chucked some spare different colored notes down the bottom. So now that we've got to this point where we can see what's there, you can also feel free to, I mean, we'll do a bit more of this later, but while we're here, if there's a couple of terms that you're like, this really should be here, I would feel free to add those in. And we're also definitely, we now have enough terms in these boxes that I think we can also do a bit more sorting, bringing things together that are maybe related or the same basic concepts. But yes, does anyone want to defend or question some choices that are here?
So personally, I didn't put those terms in. Perhaps the quality control bits I can speak for. I think it is part of sensitive data. It's to do with the integrity of the data itself. Determining sensitivity is not just a static view of data, but as we know, data evolves over time, and making sure the quality of the data is up to date is incredibly important for analyzing sensitive data. So, for example, if you weren't diagnosed with a particular condition 10 years ago, and that's the data that they were using to analyze your data, there's a risk to you, potential harm that may be inflicted on you because that data and the quality of that data was not kept up to date. In fact, in the GDPR, there is a specific clause and recital that goes into the integrity and keeping up to dateness, if that is a term, of the data.
Sushil. Did anyone want to speak to any of these other terms? Because otherwise, Sushil, something you said previously about the way that the sensitivity level of data can change over time struck a chord with me. We've been thinking in other work that I've been doing recently about what are these are things that you have to sort of actively assess, and it can be quite difficult to find out what are the trigger points for making those assessments. Do you have any thoughts about when we should check for changes in the level of sensitivity in the data that we're working with? Or does anyone else have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm happy for others to answer. I've got rules of thumb. I don't have guidelines per se. I'm happy to say my rules of thumb that I use for most of the research.
Yes, that would be really interesting.
The three rules of thumb. One, the first one is anytime you change the data set itself. So this is when you're doing some data processing activities, you have converted the data into an aggregate form or even a specific form. So you've taken ethnicity codes and you've joined them up or aggregated them together. You have to understand what is the impact of that downstream and upstream, or even the other way around as well. So any changes in the data itself is something that you need to undertake. Just another cursory view of the data impact, the data protection impact assessment, just to update the risks really. And this also includes when you combine data sets, and that's particularly challenging when you take, for example, genomic data and start linking that into electronic health record data or lab results data or patient reported outcome data. So any changes in the data element itself is something that you need to take into account. The second one is process and people changes in when you're undertaking a research project. So the way you process the data, or the people, the type of people and the skill sets that you are bringing in to who have access to the data. Again, you need to understand what is the baggage that they're bringing into that research project. You have to think of that as a box that you bring in people, process, and data and analysis code in. And anytime something goes in and out, you have to be able to assess it. And then perhaps the last one is anything that changes in the ecosystem. And that's a harder thing to keep track of and manage, admittedly. But this is when coding standards change. This is when data collection, data acquisition methodologies changed, upstream data linkage change, downstream dashboarding changes because their requirements have changed, and now the data you're producing doesn't actually conform to that. That has an impact assessment on the AI models that they might be running. So this is understanding who your upstream data providers are and who your downstream data consumers are, gives you a better handle of what is the impact that you need to do in terms of risk assessment for your research. But these are just rules of thumb. I'm sure there'll be others who will be far more well versed in this and give you a much more detailed answer.
No, I think that was a really quite a comprehensive starting point. And that point about the changes in the environment is really difficult, particularly when you're talking about also what other data sets have become available over time that might impact re-identification risk in the data set that you're dealing with. Crystal asked an interesting question to the group just before. I want to see if there are any thoughts. Obviously, we're never going to be able to capture all of the terms that are out there. We can't comprehensively survey every region and every discipline. But does anyone have any suggestions on processes or methods for how we can identify gaps?
I guess as a follow-on to that, Nicola, and if people don't have thoughts on the spot, that's totally fine. Feel free to get in touch with us asynchronously as well. To what extent should we be including disciplinary specific terms, or should we be focusing just on those terms that we know cut across disciplines and regions?
Yeah, I mean, this is intended to be eventually a tool that is useful for this community to make sure that we can communicate clearly with each other. So it's important that we understand what you guys think would be most useful to get out of it.
My point of view is we must not avoid any disciplinary, because in each disciplinary there are sensitive data that are very special. So if we just try to focus on something that is common, I think that we miss the goal.
I think that's an important point. Any effort of harmonization in terms of glossary of terms, we will only be able to address 80% of the problem, really. The 20% will be the devils in the details, I suppose, of every jurisdiction and how they manage it. So maybe we shouldn't don't let perfect be the enemy of the good, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely agreed.
Yeah, and I guess this is but step one in what will be no doubt an ongoing process. We'll no sooner get it finished, then we'll be like, new terms exist now. We'd better do a review.
I think, I mean, the comment that I'd make around, sorry, I was just going to say the comment I'd make around that is we're focusing on specific terms and concept of glossary and so on. But what I'd extract out of this is it's allowing us to see from this group, yeah, some people are probably looking at specific terms and going, oh, this term is always a issue or a problem or whatever, but it's really the concept underlying the term. And it's allowing us to kind of see what concepts within sensitive data are the ones that are maybe most essential to progress.
Yeah, and
so
I think maybe
that
once. Sorry.
Oh, go Sushil. Yeah, that's fine.
No. It's just my possibly last comment. I don't want to hog the conversation, but one thing perhaps is once we've got these terms classified together, if we can identify which terms do we actually agree on, which mean the same concept, going back to Christian's point, and where we actually have discrepancies on, so some of those comments, just maybe doing another classification within those different categories, say, yeah, these are the terms we actually agree on, that there's no, there's a shared understanding between them. But for the ones that we're not sure of, maybe we can park that into that 20% box and say we need to do further work there.
Yes, I think that is a great idea. So I think that takes us to the end of this activity. Thank you everyone so much for your contributions. I think I'll pass to, is it Crystal?
Yes, thank you, Nicola. Okay, so we have 8 minutes left, and I'm just going to briefly foreshadow for you what the future of this work will look like. Can somebody just verbally confirm they can see a slide that says future work?
Got it.
Thank you. Okay, so what's next? So thanks to everyone for your contributions today. And, you know, this was a heavy thinking exercise, so we really appreciate you putting some thought into it with us today. So we're going to take this and we're going to begin that process of curating terms, or I think maybe we need to, we need to just think through what was discussed today. I have been absolutely useless at taking notes into the notes document, but we'll review the recording and fill in the notes document and disseminate that for you as well. So really the number one thing that we want to get out of this exercise is shown in the bottom right-hand corner there. We want to have a curated set of terms that we can then identify similarities, differences, and then provide a summary definition that we're going to use in our interest group. But then bigger picture thinking, and this is represented in the top left there, and this comes from our roadmap. Bigger picture thinking is that we want to produce a set of outputs from this vocabulary work overall. So thinking about outputs for sharing work and progressing the future of this, this stream of work, we want to develop a glossary of terms that we can have endorsed by RDA. We want to write a paper sharing our experience of understanding this work. And we want our new understanding of sensitive data terminology to inform perhaps a revisiting of the survey that kicked off this work in the first instance. And then really big picture thinking for translation and impact further down the line. We'd be interested in looking at how we can write a more formal vocabulary that could be used to enhance machine actionability of sensitive data. And we'd be interested in developing a toolkit for translating these findings between diverse audiences. And so I think in particular, we're interested in finding these sensitive data terms that cut across the regions and disciplines as a way of translating between these. But this conversation we only just had about disciplinary and region-specific terms is also very informative, so thank you for that. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I just want to drop a couple of links in chat for you. Yep, hopefully you can not see my screen anymore. So I'm just going to do a big link dump in chat. Apologies in advance. That looks absolutely terrible, sorry. But please do view our poster if you're hovering around the poster exhibition. I think you have to view it through the Mover platform, but there's a link there directly to the RDA site as well. Do feel free to sign up for our community meetings, open to all, never too late to jump in. We continue a lot of this kind of talk at our community meetings as well, and no doubt our July community meeting will be heavy on reviewing what we've learnt from P19. Do join our interest group if you haven't already joined. Just visit the page and click sign up. And if you're not a member of the RDA, it's free to join. So sign up to the RDA and then join our interest group. We keep a pretty good history of posts on our RDA site, which just detail notes and recordings from our previous community meetings, as well as sharing other outputs. There's a link to our post page. Feel free to have a look through that. And finally, we have a growing Zenodo library as well. So all of our meeting recordings are on there. The roadmap will be on there. No doubt one day eventually the vocabulary will be on there as well. So just some useful links that you might find helpful. Anyway, I think that wraps up our session for today. So thanks to all the organisers of International Data Week and all the organisers of RDA Plenary 19 as well who made this happen. Thank you so much to Sushil for getting up at 4 a.m, probably earlier, I'm sure, to be here to present and to contributing to our discussion. It's been immensely valuable. Thanks as well to my co-chairs and of course to you, the community, for coming along and making this an engaging and interesting session as always. So that's it. We get a 3-minute early mark.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Sushil.
Thanks,
For
Sushil.
inviting
Thanks,
me.
everyone.
And hey, Nicola, can you save the chat or is that something that happens later?
I have done it as well.
Oh, nice. Thanks,
Thank
Stephanie.
you. I've saved the Hover chat, but I got kicked out, so I can't get all the Zoom chat. But thank you, Stephanie.
I've only saved the Zoom chat. I wasn't in Hoover.
Perfect. Between the two of us, we've got
Well, there we go.
Thank you.
How do you save the Hover chat? Do you just copy it?
Yeah, I just copied it. And I'll just got lovely photos of everybody.